This is a module on biology of behavior. I'm going to talk about the anatomy, the basic anatomy of the brain in this submodule. Let us first talk about the metabolic costs of the brain. Despite it being about 2% approximately of our total body weight, it is so demanding with metabolic resources. It receives about 15 to 20% of our blood, and it's consuming about 20% of our total oxygen consumption and about 25% of our blood sugar, particularly the glucose. You can really tell how demanding it is, and you can say that it is well justified given its main functions that it is serving to us. In terms of the metabolic costs of the brain, the first three right here, the food or the glucose, fluid, and the oxygen it is consuming, as mentioned earlier, has to be physically or physiologically sustained. And as part of the lifestyle operating in helping our brain operate as part of its needs, its metabolic costs, can also includes sleep. And lastly, this is the most interesting part, we need to be well versed in our environment. The experience right here is referring to the learning. We need to continuously learn as part of what we are feeding our brain. So for it to be sharp, we need to keep on learning. That's part of the metaphysical component of feeding our brain. Okay, so let us talk about the anatomical orientation, adding vocabulary on how we are referring to some parts of our body by being specific to the orientation of our anatomy. So let us refer to the image on the left. We refer to medial, then lateral, referring to the center, then to the from the center to the extremities orientation, and then ventral and dorsal is referring to your uh, orientation facing forward, and then on your back is dorsal. And then proximal and distal is referring to how close it is to the center of your body, and then distal would be referring to how far it is from your center. So proximal means closer, distal means farther. Then on the vertical orientation, again, we are referring to our cranial, our skull, literally, and then caudal, we are referring to the sole of our feet. If we are to look at, let's say, the brain, we have different orientations in terms of how it can be cut so that we can observe the different parts that are more visible according to different orientations. Let's say if we are to cut or to split our brain in half in this manner, we are referring to the sagittal plane. So that's a sagittal cut, sagittal view of the brain. This is this middle part. We can observe the limbic system more uh, in the sagittal cut orientation. And then we also have the coronal. So this is coronal plane. Okay, this is the coronal plane. We will observe here the white matter and the gray matter. So the white matter here is referring to the center bound contents, and then the pinkish ones are the gray matter, is the gray matter. The white matter is mostly composed of the axons, and the gray matter is mostly composed of the cell bodies and some axons. It is explained that Phineas Gage was able to survive because only the white matter is mostly damaged, but not the gray matter. Then on a horizontal cut, okay, the transverse plane, so this is the cut of the brain. Usually in MRI, they are looking at the horizontal orientation in terms of the brain slices. Okay. We can also observe the white matter and the gray matter in this orientation. Okay, so let's move forward. Now, okay, so just a quick depiction of how the brain looks like. It's a bit in profile. We will see the cerebellum and the cortex. This is the cortex and this is the cerebellum. Our forebrain is mostly concerned with our perception, abstract functions, our decision making. And our brainstem is inside here. It's difficult to observe if it were not cut in the sagittal orientation. The cerebellum is mostly concerned with our coordination, our movements. And then let's imagine that we have the spinal cord right here. Okay. We will have more images along the way. Okay, so let's talk about it in different sets. First, first let's talk about the brainstem involving the pons and the medulla, and then the other parts in the hindbrain. Okay, so we have the pons and the medulla, also called the brainstem. The pons and the medulla are involved in coordinating our breathing, so that's very vital for us. It is concerned with also with our heartbeat. So if you have a brain damage, it is likely that your pons and medulla is still intact if you are unconscious because your heartbeat and your breathing is still operating. In case that it's no longer working, it has to be artificially assisted by a machine to help the lungs to contract and expand in order for the oxygen to be in order for the oxygen to come in and supply our cells. So it is very crucial if someone would have a damage in their brainstem because it supplies the very basic function in our basic vital signs. And then for the thalamus, we are referring to it as the sensory switchboard because it is coordinating the sensory signals coming from the peripheral nervous system to the spinal cord, and finally, it's integrated in the thalamus. The most notable function of the thalamus is the crossover function, wherein the sensory receptors coming from the right uh, arms and legs are redirected towards our left hemisphere and vice versa. The sensory receptors and motor response on our of our limbs are coordinated to our right hemisphere. So let's say if I have a damage on my left hemisphere involving my sensory motor functions, then I can be paralyzed only on the right side of my limbs, but not on the left side because of the thalamus wherein it crossed over the left and the right side of our limbs. Next, we have the reticular formation. It is a network of nerves that is involved in our alertness. This is responsible, along with others, in making us wide awake. Then I already mentioned cerebellum. It is very notable since it is involved in our nonverbal memory involving our procedural learning, especially our coordination or our motor movement. So in an actual brain, you can observe the brainstem. Notice here the pons and the medulla. You can imagine the spinal cord right here to be connected straight. And then the limbic system, which is the next part, major part that we will talk about, is only observed within or easily identifiable when it is cut in a sagittal orientation. If our brainstem is primarily involved in our vital functions, vital signs, we are now moving to the limbic system as we go further inside the brain. The limbic system is very popular when it comes to coordinating our emotions and how we respond to our emotions. The parts right here in the limbic system, we are referring to the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. As for the hippocampus, we are looking at the hippocampus, which is it described to be like a seahorse shaped part of the limbic system. It processes conscious episodic memories and it is connected with our coordinating with our amygdala in order to store highly intense emotions, and we it it is salient in our memory when we feel things, when we experience strong emotions. This is in the aid of the hippocampus. And then the amygdala is very iconic, as it is primarily responsible to our threat detection from our environment. So we experience fear, and then it directs us to motivate our behavior to address the situation because of the fear that we are experiencing. For example, if our amygdala is removed, so in among experiments in the animals, their fear response is attenuated or totally removed. This can inhibit their protective behavior tendencies, wherein they no longer detect danger from their environment, and therefore their protective behaviors become deactivated. Then next we have the hypothalamus. This is working hand in hand with the pituitary gland, because once it receives signal from the pituitary gland, it will coordinate through signals to the different parts of the brain, and it is well networked because its main function is to maintain homeostasis. As part, as considered to be a part of the endocrine system, it is helping, or it is mostly associated with the reward center in our brain, where we can link our responses to our environment when we are associating reward with the behavior. If we are unable to link those, then the learning may be difficult. So the learning involving reinforcement is facilitated by the hypothalamus as well. Here is a brief review of the brain structure. You can refer back to it as we go along in our discussion. I'm going to talk about the four lobes of the cortex. The divisions of the brain right here is oriented because of the how the brain developed, but I'd like to focus on the lobes of the cortex. This is the crown part of the brain, and it is easy to recognize because of, in a way, isolated functioning, that it receives certain stimuli from the environment, and how it receives signal is primarily processed by these divisions of our cortex. We have the frontal, the occipital, the parietal, and then the temporal. The occipital lobe, located at the back, is concerned with processing the visual stimuli. We have the light. We can sense the light, and then we can distinguish the differences between the lines, the objects. We can notice the contrast. We can notice the vertical and the horizontal orientation of objects. We can perceive depth. So that's how complex our visual processes can be when it comes to coordinating and processing our visual perception. Then on the auditory, so you will notice here it has a fissure, lateral fissure, a major division in your auditory between your frontal and parietal cortex. The auditory, as the temporal is the temporal lobe is concerned with the auditory stimuli, processing our auditory stimuli. The auditory lobe is compensating when it is observed to be compensating in terms of its volume among the blind individuals. Because if our occipital lobe is not being utilized well, especially among the blind individuals, the neurons in the auditory, the temporal lobe, is overcompensating for the loss of the occipital lobe. And then we have the parietal right here. We are mostly concerned with the sensory motor coordination in the parietal lobe. And then in the frontal lobe, it is said to be the latest in our evolution. as it is more involved with abstract reasoning, problem solving, decision making, our working memory. It is said to be located primarily processing within the frontal lobe. This is a visualization of how the sensory motor cortex is coordinating the left and right hemisphere, as we mentioned earlier in the thalamus, where we have the switchboard, the crossover. The left hemisphere sensory and motor cortex is they are processing the left hemisphere is processing the right side, and the right hemisphere is processing the left side of our limbs, our sensory motor connection, as we are receiving stimuli through our sensory receptors and our afferent neurons. And then as we respond to our environment, we have our efferent neurons signaling our motor reaction to to different stimuli, depending on whether it is a threat or not a threat. You will appreciate the anatomy of the brain better when you see an actual specimen of the brain. But it'll be more difficult to notice the specific parts because the image is quite clear in the slides, and it can be morphed in the actual specimen of the brain. This is the end of this submodule, Basic Anatomy of the Brain.